Whatever. Don't even care. The cat. Okay.
And technologist, former CIA officer, and NSA contractor. In 2013, he revealed that the NSA and unconstitutionally seizing the private records.
Eat food?
Hey guys, I know it's a weird time right now. A lot of us have been stuck at home for a bit, some voluntarily, some not. And you can't check social media or turn on TV without seeing something about the horrifying global pandemic. Do you think quarantines and closures are overreaction or not? I think everyone of every political persuasion can agree on at least one thing. Our government has not handled this COVID-19 thing very well. For weeks, doctors in the U.S. weren't allowed to test patients for the virus at all. Then, the only tests available were from the CDC that took a week to get results. And many of those tests turned out to be faulty. Not only did FDA regulations prohibit private labs in the U.S. from developing their own tests, they barred unapproved tests that were already successfully in use in other countries from being imported. The first major outbreak in Washington was discovered only after a Seattle lab decided to ignore the regulations and run their own tests in defiance of the FDA. Fortunately, the government did eventually drop their prohibition on private labs developing their own tests, which are much faster and, work. But there were still a number of regulations imposed by the FDA and other agencies that stood in the way of rapid progress in fighting the disease, like prohibiting at-home testing and restricting companies like Tesla, Ford, and GM from producing and selling ventilators, even though they'd offered to do so. These problems have come as a surprise to a lot of people in the U.S., but they really shouldn't. The FDA has a long history of slowing the progress of innovation in healthcare. And since you're probably stuck at home, instead of rewatching Outbreak or Contagion for the 13th time, I'd like to direct your attention to a much better movie on Netflix that actually addresses some of the underlying problems our country is facing right now. Dallas Buyers Club. Stick around for this short edition of How to Free. Dallas Buyers Club was released in 2013 and tells the mostly true story of Ron Woodruff, played by Matthew McConaughey. If you haven't seen it, go ahead and do that, then come back to this video, because only recommendation is to go to a support group for other AIDS patients condemned to die.
Screw the FDA. I'm going to be away.
The first act of Dallas Buyers Club is really hard to watch. Reeling from his diagnosis and being rejected by his former rodeo cowboy friends, Ron had nothing left to hospital. He makes a deal with the hospital to steal EZT from the truck. Once that gets cut off, he goes to an unlicensed doctor in Mexico. After a couple months of fairly successful treatment, he and the doctor set up a deal to smuggle drugs into the U.S. and sell them to other patients. This eventually leads to creating the Buyers Club in Dallas. Ron isn't actually selling drugs and supplements. He's selling information. The club members just happen to get access to these treatments as a perk. Unfortunately for Ron and his club members, he keeps bumping up against the FDA and their enlisted help, the DEA and the IRS. Ron is fined, his medicine is confiscated, he's threatened with arrest. Ron attempts to fight back, filing a restraining order against the FDA. That doesn't work. He sues the agency for denying him his right to treatment. That fails too, even though the judge agrees that the FDA's behavior is morally reprehensible. Ron just wanted to survive and believed that all people have a right to treatment. The alternative is certain death. You see this play out over and over in real life. People with conditions and diseases like HIV, cancer, autoimmune disorders, and more suffer needlessly because the FDA won't approve drugs that have been used in other countries for years. People who use medical marijuana and psychedelics to treat physical and psychological problems understand the obstacles the FDA and other government agencies put in the way of drug research and approval, in spite of the fact that the federal government actually holds patents on a lot of those treatments. It even affects people who just want to drink the milk they want to drink. Right now, places like New York City are seeing firsthand how FDA restrictions that prevent companies from urgently importing and producing much-needed medical supplies like ventilators, masks, and other protective gear can cause really serious problems. And it doesn't stop at the FDA. We've all talked a lot lately about overloaded hospitals and our limited capacity to treat COVID-19 patients. But what most people don't know is that the government and the American Medical Association limits the number of doctors we train, and we've known for years that we would face a real shortage in healthcare providers, something we really don't need right now. Worse still, most cities have what's called certificate of need laws that prevent the development and construction of new hospitals. Con laws allow other hospitals and clinics in certain areas to decide whether their potential competitors can expand their capabilities or enter the market at all. Contrary to popular belief, healthcare in America is far, far from a free market. And it's precisely that bureaucratic, centralized control and the regulatory restrictions that are killing us now, just like they did in the 80s during the AIDS epidemic. Oh, and by the way, thanks to illegally acquiring AZT, Ron Woodruff beat his 30-day prognosis by 7 years. And today, the drug is approved and used in AIDS treatment and prevention all over the world. The good news is that finally, some of these rules are being lifted, if only temporarily in some cases, allowing people to get what they need when they actually need it. If you're searching for silver linings right now, it could be that after this is all over, maybe, just maybe, more people will realize how involved government at all levels already is in their everyday lives, health, and well-being, and reject plans to expand its role in the future. We need life-saving medicine and medical technology right now. And the best way to incentivize rapid innovation, production, and distribution is by allowing entrepreneurs to do what they do best. But to do that, we have to reduce the artificial barriers, price controls, and top-down political authority in the healthcare system. The lessons of economics aren't magically suspended in life or death situations. To the contrary, learning them now is more important. Hey everybody, thanks for watching this short edition of Out of Frame. I know this one was a little different than usual, so be sure to let me know what you think in the comments. If you want to know more about the FDA and the other regulations I mentioned, check out the links in the description, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to all our social channels on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
At the October 13, 1988 presidential debate, Michael Dukakis and George H.W. Bush were asked,
who are the heroes who are there in American life today? Who are the ones that you would point out to young Americans as figures who should inspire this country?
I'm Escalante, Villadares, those people that took us back into space again, sports heroes.
Vice President Bush eventually responded with,
I think of Dr. Fauci. Well, I never heard of him. You did, and heard of him. He's a very fine research top doctor at National Institute of Health, working hard doing something about research on this disease of AIDS.
today, Dr. Anthony S. Fauci is best known because of his position in the coronavirus task force and for his many media appearances. In the U.S., he's one of the most recognizable faces in the current crisis. How did this doctor go from his research lab in Bethesda, Maryland, to becoming one of the most visible medical experts on the pandemic today?
Dr. Fauci.
Dr. Fauci, thank you so much for taking the time.
Dr. Fauci.
Dr. Anthony Fauci.
The June 5th, 1981 weekly report by the Centers for Disease Control was a notable one. It reported 5 unusual cases of pneumonia. These cases would become known as some of the earliest reports of AIDS. The next year, Dr. Anthony Fauci wrote an early paper about the disease, which had increased to 290 recognized cases and had become a public health problem of essentially epidemic proportions. Fauci worked at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, NIAID, heading up a lab that studied immune system response. NIAID conducts research on diseases to help understand, treat, and prevent them. It falls under the National Institutes of Health, or NIH, the medical research agency part of the Department of Health and
Where's
Human
your food?
Services.
Come.
In the early 80s, the NIH had many institutes, with NIAID and National Cancer Institute leading investigation of the new virus and disease that would become known as HIV/AIDS. Fauci made that investigation the focus of his career.
We're going to be listening to Dr. Anthony Fauci. He's going to be talking about AIDS.
I'm working directly on AIDS, both clinically and from a basic science standpoint. That really is one of the few, or actually one of the only subjects where you really have to change your lecture.
Fauci was named director of NIAID in 1984, and the then director of Health and Human Services highlighted Fauci's background in immunology and infectious diseases as a main reason for his appointment.
A major effort was directed at determining if a variant of this virus could actually cause depletion of lymphocytes or acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. And as it turned out, a variant of that virus, in fact, caused the syndrome.
Fauci's leading.
The scientific data is overwhelming that, in fact, AIDS cannot be transmitted by casual contact.
But it was a later political test that shows how Fauci navigated the AIDS crisis and secured his career. In the summer of 1988, playwright Larry Kramer wrote an open letter to Anthony Fauci, calling him an incompetent idiot and a murderer. His opinion was broadly reflective of activists, most notably the organization Kramer inspired, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, or ACTUM. In 1986, Fauci had reinforced his position as the leading scientist for the federal AIDS effort. He created a new division to focus on the disease and earned other significant NIH posts. But progress was slow, especially for a disease as deadly as AIDS, where patients died on average 15 months after diagnosis. Fauci and NIAID were responsible for starting trials for new drugs, which the FDA required for approval. In June 1986, NIAID created a network of clinical trial centers around the country, though they were criticized as ineffective. Activists argued that the NIH, the FDA, and leadership up to President Reagan had failed to take the crisis seriously. This photo from an October 1988 protest shows the key complaints. At the time, the FDA's lengthy drug approvals required strict scientific clinical trials. It was textbook science. The disease killed at a faster pace than the FDA's process. If you entered a trial, a certain percentage of patients got the drug and a certain percentage got a placebo. This helped test if the drugs were safe and if they really worked. That was important because many AIDS drugs didn't pan out. But with AIDS, getting a placebo was a death sentence. And that meant fewer volunteers for clinical trials. The epidemic needed a radical approach, but experimental approaches like aerosolized contaminants helped treat one of the most common infections caused by AIDS. Yet trials had been delayed by NIAID, which Fauci blamed on insufficient staff. Under pressure, he acknowledged the approval problem in 1988. Testifying in Congress that he would go for what is available on the street if he were a patient. A blunt rebuke to FDA policy keeping these new approaches out of reach. Fauci also went on to admit that it took them a long time to start trials of dextromethorphan, a drug that had only enthusiasm among AIDS patients. For the few approved options, like the then promising drug AZT, activists criticized the high prices charged by maker girls Qualcomm. All these issues had spawned large networks of buyers clubs, AIDS patients who pooled their resources to import non-FDA approved drugs. In 1990, activists staged another major protest, this time at the NIH in Bethesda, Maryland, where Fauci worked. It was a turning point. In two key ways, Fauci incorporated these sharp activist criticisms and ideas into the government response. In 1990, NIAID invited activist representatives into the administrative committees for every AIDS clinical trial group. This allowed for the government response to include on-the-ground knowledge. Starting in 1989, Fauci had also voiced support for a new program called Parallel Track, forcing the FDA to consider it. In it, patients who couldn't participate in clinical trials could still get unapproved drugs once they've been tested for basic safety. Even if some drugs didn't work, at least they would be available to try. The day ACT UP stormed the NIH in May 1990, the Federal Register published the FDA's plans to adopt a parallel track plan.
I'm Dr. Anthony Fauci.
19 years before Brad Pitt played Anthony Fauci on Saturday Night Live, SNL cast member Chris Kattan played him in 2001 during an anthrax scare. 2 decades ago, Fauci was already the face of public health response to unusual diseases. That included everything from anthrax and flu updates to running the U.S. government's massive AIDS treatment program in Africa under President George W. Bush. All that's helped his relationship with activists. Fauci called Larry Kramer a dear friend who was a longtime nemesis. I remember he wanted to get my attention by writing an open letter to that incompetent idiot, Dr. Tony Fauci. He needed to stir the pot. By staying in the same role at NIAID since 1984, Fauci became a fixture across 5 NIH directors, 8 Centers for Disease Control directors, and 8 Surgeons General. They're appointed by the president, and Fauci's been around for 6 of them. As the director of NIAID, he's insulated from that political element. The AIDS response in particular illustrates how Fauci manages stakeholders from inside and outside the government, and from above and below his position. That and his scientific expertise has made him a constant during the new crisis, too.
Our recent advances of being able to isolate, identify, and characterize the agent, together with the advances in understanding the natural history and pathophysiology of this disease, will allow us over the next year to come back to you and tell you that we now not only have this, but that we have a real prevention and indeed a real cure. Thank you.
Hello, I'm very good afternoon to all of you. So, related drugs, HIV एड रिलेटेड ड्रग्स, तो इसके अंदर हम जिस ड्रग के बारे में पढ़ने जा रहे हैं, ठीक है, जो ड्रग रहेगा दैट विल बी अवर जो हमारा ड्रग है दैट इज योर जाइडोव्यूडीन, ठीक है। लेकिन हम इससे पहले जो हमारे HIV एड्स रिलेटेड जो भी हमारे पास ये एंटी हमारे रेट्रोवायरल ड्रग्स होते हैं इनके बारे में थोड़ा सा पहले पढ़ेंगे। तो जो हमारे पास HIV एड्स होता है, ठीक है, ये जो हमारे इसके रिलेटेड जो हमारे ड्रग्स होते हैं दे फॉल अंडर द कैटेगरी ऑफ अवर एंटीवायरल एजेंट्स, ठीक है।
Okay. Go. I'll get you more food. Okay. There we go. Fucking dog treats love you. Fucking ton. Got pancreatitis. Okay. But doesn't. Fish your pancreatitis, but then apparently doesn't make or some other stuff. Go eat your food. No. Go eat your food. Hello. Are you telling me what I was thinking? Yeah, it just had like one person to 8:15. Okay, wait. Okay. No. What's up, baby? Oh, I know you just want my chicken to got a piece of this. It's true. But okay. Go on, you're telling me.
Tonight, Dispatches challenges the claims made for the main anti-AIDS drug AZT. In America, later this evening, the results of a new study of life expectancy for those on the drug will be published. Those results will throw new doubt on the effectiveness of AZT. Tonight's Dispatch is the third on the subject of AIDS. As before, the programme's advice is clear. No one should alter medication without consulting a doctor, still less on the basis of a television programme. But the role of tonight's Dispatch is to examine the evidence. It will argue that in this country, the Wellcome Foundation, the manufacturers, are making false and misleading claims about the drug and could be in breach of the law. That's AZT, cause for concern.
In May 1990, the American AIDS activist group ACT UP organized a demonstration outside the National Institutes of Health in Maryland. They were protesting about AZT, or zidovudine, the only approved drug for AIDS at that time.
You're not getting
It
my
wasn't
food.
working, and ACT UP members wanted more research effort put into finding a cure for AIDS.
No, have all the treats.
This was a remarkable about turn, because 3 years earlier, other ACT UP demonstrations had clamored for more AZT to be made available at a cheaper price. What had changed? For several years, the rock magazine Spin has run an AIDS column. In it, journalist Celia Farber has kept a close and critical watch on AZT.
Attitudes about AZT have changed dramatically over the last couple of years, and especially in the last year. The leaders of the gay community in the major cities here were on AZT, many of them, in the beginning, and then when it stopped working for them, they turned around and they said it isn't working, whereas initially they had defended it so adamantly.
A lot of the people who were involved with ACT UP and who were on nucleoside analogs like AZT had bad experiences with the drug eventually. And then there was a panic, and then there was this realization, this horrible disillusionment that indeed the drugs that they were begging the government to get into their bodies were in fact very ineffective, if not toxic.
If they were aware that the drug had unfortunate side effects, why were people so anxious to take it?
Because there didn't seem to be any alternative. The propaganda was that AIDS is 100% fatal, which it isn't. There is a 15% survival rate today. And of course, people were living longer, and people were desperate at that time, didn't know much. AIDS is basically political, has been politicized, moralized in this country, and there's a lot of misinformation about the disease.
Through public protests and demonstrations, AIDS activists were giving voice to serious misgivings about toxicity and the expectations for AZT amongst leading doctors and scientists.
I think the central fact is that despite 5 years of AZT in trials and 4 on the open market, people keep dying in large numbers, and hence it is clearly not as wonderful a drug or a lifesaver as it is made out.
First of all, I think it's self-evident that our study does not provide the kind of benefit that everyone wished for. It can't be a secret that patients wanted something that would help them live longer. Unfortunately, it has not demonstrated that, and therefore this has to be unwelcome news.
Well, the effect of AZT on body cells as a whole is very deleterious because it prevents cells from replicating.
There's a second point in that cells that may survive AZT may themselves become cancerous. So there's a double danger for AZT the way I see it.
When AZT was licensed in the United States in 1987, hopes were running high. Tucked away in a corner of the massive Jackson Memorial Hospital complex is Miami University's AIDS Research Unit. Here, Dr. Margaret Fischel was one of the leading figures in the trials that led to the licensing of the drug.
I think in the very beginning, when the studies were actually being designed, our greatest expectation or hope would be progression of the disease. It would improve quality of life, decrease the severity of the disease. Although we designed survival benefits into the study, we actually did not expect to see them.
At San Francisco General, Dr. Paul Volberding, another leading AZT researcher, supports AZT's early track record.
The drug approved in 1987 for use in what we would now call advanced HIV disease, patients who had substantial deterioration on the basis of a clinical trial that was really quite short, but a trial that showed, compared to placebo, a rather striking difference in the mortality rate in patients with AIDS. So we started our experience with the sense that this was a very active drug clinically, but with still questions to be answered about the appropriate use of the drug, the appropriate dose of the drug.
The results of the early AZT trial on people with full-blown AIDS appeared to be so convincing that the drug was given a new fast-track approval by the United States Food and Drug Administration before any long-term toxicity trials in animals had been completed.
These new regulations specifically will have special criteria that would apply to immediately life-threatening conditions, recognizing that such patients are willing to accept a greater risk than that which normally would be the case.
The Wellcome Foundation, UK manufacturer of AZT, saw its shares spiral upwards. AZT was to be the new wonder drug. Then, in 1989, after further trials were terminated early in the United States because results looked promising, it was announced that AZT could be used not only on people with AIDS diseases, but in a much larger group, with HIV and low immune cell counts, but no other symptoms. Wellcome shares soared to new heights, adding £1.4 billion to the company's UK stock market value in one day. Today, annual sales of AZT are worth around £170 million. Opening up the drug's use to so-called asymptomatics means a substantial increase in the number of people who could be prescribed AZT indefinitely. In the UK, the estimated number of HIV-positive people is 50,000. In the United States, it's around 1 million. This 1990 US poster campaign, Living with HIV, was co-sponsored by Burroughs Wellcome. People were encouraged to get tested for HIV. The posters said,
"Early medical intervention could put time on your side."
As AZT was the only approved drug for AIDS at the time, this was a way of increasing Wellcome's market for the drug.
I think it's a disgrace. It lures people into the belief that if they're HIV positive, they should go and get themselves tested, and that there's an answer that will keep them alive, and that's far from the truth.
More and more people with no symptoms of AIDS, but who have HIV and a low immune cell or T-cell count, are being drawn into AZT studies. The Concord trial, based here at the Middlesex Hospital and at the Brompton Hospital in London, involves some 3,000 British and French participants with HIV, but no AIDS symptoms. In October last year, a progress meeting was held at the Terence Higgins Trust. We were barred, but an amateur recording has been handed to us. Professor Ian Weller, chairman of the Concord Trial Working Party, argued the case for continuing the trial.
It seems to me that the Data and Safety Monitoring Committee feel very comfortable in allowing this study to proceed into what I think is new territory. And my feeling is that it's that territory that most patients and physicians are interested in. That is, if there is benefit, is it maintained, or will it wear off? in which case we may cause more harm than good.
Professor Weller said that the monitoring committee found no clear evidence on which to base new recommendations for clinical practice, and that the trial into AZT or zidovudine would continue for a further 7 months. He also said,
My feeling is that this is the only chance that anyone will have of sorting out the uncertainty that I think is at the basis of some of the frustration. That is, whether it is better in the mid to long term rather than short term to give zidovudine early, or rather leave it to a later stage of infection. Early intervention does make biological sense, but the question, the pragmatic question, the tactical question is, do we have the right tool?
AZT was first developed in 1964 as a cancer chemotherapy drug. It was designed to destroy proliferating cancer cells. Later, at the U.S. National Cancer Institute in Maryland, it was tested as an AIDS drug. Normally, cancer chemotherapy drugs are used for limited periods, but AZT is given for open-ended use. Its effect on the body can be very serious. Some people simply can't tolerate it and suffer vomiting, muscle pain, and unendurable headaches. Lower doses produce less side effects, but on high doses, bone marrow cells are affected, with up to 30% of recipients needing blood transfusions.
I believe that the drug AZT can have at least 2 important areas of toxicity, and that is the inhibition of production of malignant cells, such as lymphoma cells. These 2 courses can be monitored, but they can also reach the point of no return, where nothing can be done about it. So even with monitoring, these toxicities can be life-threatening.
Although the effects of AZT, also called by its generic name zidovudine, are listed in Wellcome's US and UK information sheets for doctors, their promotional leaflet for doctors and the public in the UK makes some startling claims of AZT's safety and efficacy. For example, it states here that doctors can manage the serious blood problems and
there are no life-threatening toxicities associated with zidovudine.
These and other claims have encouraged some doctors and patients to embark upon high-dose therapies, sometimes over long periods of time. There is evidence that some of these claims are false and others seriously misleading. There are worrying differences and omissions between the US and UK doctors' information sheets. Before a drug is licensed for use, it normally has to undergo animal toxicity studies and clinical trials in humans. No long-term animal studies were completed when AZT was licensed. The clinical studies in humans called Phase 2, which led to the licensing of AZT, were financed by Wellcome. They were presented as complying with the only reliable scientific test for a drug, double-blind studies, and published in the New England Journal of Medicine in July 1987. In this type of trial, one group is given the drug and the other a placebo or a dummy tablet. Neither the volunteers nor their doctors should know who is getting what, in order to eliminate any bias in expectation of what a particular treatment or no treatment may do. This is called blinding. In this document, Wellcome claims that
none of the volunteers or the clinicians involved knew who had received placebo and who had received the active drug.
We have the following evidence that the trials became unblinded early on. This internal document from the Food and Drug Administration, the US authority that licensed the drug, was obtained through the Freedom of Information procedure. Dr. Ellen Cooper, in reviewing the AZT data, writes,
The fact that the treatment groups unblinded themselves early could have resulted in bias in the workup of patients.
If the FDA knew this, then Wellcome would have been incompetent not to know.
Hey, how's it going?
Through the pages of the New York Native, a gay weekly newspaper, journalist John Lauritsen, author of the book AZT, Poison by Prescription, and deputy editor Nina Ostrom have kept up constant pressure about inconsistencies in the events that led up to the licensing of AZT.
There were so many contradictions. But the real horror of this study only became apparent after going through documents which were obtained under the Freedom of Information Act. And it indicated that there had been not only sloppiness of every conceivable sort, but that there had been actual cheating in a number of areas. It indicated that the study had become unblinded very quickly in the first few weeks. Although it was planned as a double-blind, placebo-controlled study, in fact, it was nothing of the kind. Both patients and doctors knew who was getting AZT and who was getting placebo.
As far as we can ascertain, everyone in the phase 2 trial has died. Chris Babick of People with AIDS Coalition used to advise trial participants on a telephone helpline where they could get their pills analyzed.
During the phase 2 trials, we received many phone calls in our office from individuals who wanted to determine whether or not they were using the placebo or actually receiving AZT. And there were 3 laboratories in New York which would analyze the medication. We would refer individuals there. If, in fact, they were on placebo, they would make arrangements to acquire the drug AZT. Oftentimes, they would share it with individuals who were in the trials. That's really rendering the phase 2 trial, unblinding the phase 2 trial.
Dr. Michael Lang helped run one of the trial centers.
I don't think they were really blinded because when you take AZT, your red blood cells increase in size, and this happens after 2 to 3 weeks, and you can notice that on an ordinary blood count. And since blood counts were monitored and the information fed back to patients, this information was available to the investigators.
Well, I don't think it's completely true that the trial was unblinded. There, in retrospect, are ways that we could have known who was taking the drug. The drug causes the red blood cells, for example, to enlarge in size, but that wasn't really known at the time. And so I think that trial was, in fact, quite well blinded.
Did you know that the phase 2 trial became unblinded early on in the study?
Well, I don't think it became unblinded. I think that's, fanfare and does incredible misjustice to when you say unblinding. I mean, you assume that the whole study is unblinded, that both patients, physicians know exactly what they're on. And that typically does not happen in most clinical trials. Are patients suspicious sometimes of what they're on? Yes. Do they necessarily change their behavior because of that? No. Do physicians, nurses that care for patients in blinded studies sometimes suspect what the patient is on? Yes. Does that necessarily change their behavior in the conduct of a trial? No. They typically will proceed with the conduct of the trial as it is outlined.
Well, one could argue over how much of an effect it would have for a study to become unblinded. Certainly all kinds of bias are possible. It could be everything from the psychological effect on the patient to the way that the doctor managed it. But certainly the gold standard of drug testing is a double-blind placebo-controlled study. And most importantly, if the study was not blinded, it is dishonest to describe it as being a blind study. And to this very day, the advocates of AZT continue to say that this was a double-blind study, when it was certainly nothing of the sort.
We would like to put some questions to the Borough's Wellcome Company based here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Wellcome financed the phase 2 trials that led to the fast-track approval of AZT. They declined our invitation to be interviewed. In this same UK promotional leaflet, Wellcome claims that AZT is an antiviral drug. The leaflet gives the impression that AZT can target the HIV virus without killing cells. Professor of Molecular Biology at Berkeley, California, Peter Duesberg, is known for his view that HIV is not the cause of AIDS. His concern about the use of AZT stems not simply from this view, but from a criticism of AZT's molecular activity. He objects to Wellcome's claim that AZT is an antiviral drug.
That is a euphemism. It's not harm.
but it kills or inhibits all DNA synthesis. Everything that's going. It inhibits the cell first, and with it, the virus.
All like A that doesn't affect DNA. Peter Duesberg and some other leading scientists claim that HIV has never been shown in humans to present a meaningful target for AZT. In order to understand these assertions, we need to examine the way in which a retrovirus like HIV works.
The blueprint for all living cells is double-stranded DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. But a retrovirus is different. It's made of single-stranded RNA, ribonucleic acid, which in order to replicate needs to insert itself into a cell's nuclear DNA. So a retrovirus like HIV doesn't destroy its host cell. It penetrates the cell wall and with the help of an enzyme called reverse transcriptase, converts its own single strand of RNA into a double strand of DNA. It can then insert itself into the nucleus of the cell. The fundamental life-giving process of cell regeneration depends on DNA, which is made up of 4 building blocks that shot together. One of these is called thymidine. AZT is a copy or analog of thymidine, which when it attaches itself to the viral DNA chain, stops it, because nothing else can attach itself. Some scientists claim that whether a cell is infected with HIV or not, AZT terminates the DNA chain, stopping more DNA from being formed.
It inhibits the replication or duplication of DNA and thereby prevents the cell itself from duplicating.
Wellcome claims that AZT can target HIV and delay symptoms of AIDS in people who are HIV positive by inhibiting HIV when reverse transcription takes place.
Once it enters that cell, the drug has to undergo a transformation so it becomes active. And then it actually prevents the virus from getting into the genetic makeup of a cell and infecting that cell.
But Duesberg maintains that AZT can't prevent the virus from infecting that cell without killing it and others as well. In people who are given AZT, healthy or sick, only 1 in 500 cells is ever infected by HIV. That is to say, in order to kill that 1 infected cell, AZT will have to kill 500 normal cells, good cells that people, particularly with AIDS, desperately need to survive. And healthy people need it too. It is like trying to kill the 1 terrorist in a city like Berkeley of 200,000 by putting poison in the tap water. You may get the terrorist, but you will get most of the other people as well. But does AZT have a viral target at all? Peter Duesberg maintains that once a person has developed antibodies to HIV, HIV becomes inactive, and there's essentially no more reverse transcription going on for AZT to target. There's no evidence for it. It's not detectable, and the numbers of infected cells remain the same. It remains very low and remains constant, which is direct proof that further infection is not taking place. Further infection depends on reverse transcription. Dr. Harvey Bialy supports this view. He is research editor of biotechnology, sister to the science journal Nature. In this interview, he is expressing his personal views.
The majority of the time that a person is infected with HIV, there is essentially no reverse transcriptase activity that can be detected. So it is really beyond me. Reverse transcription of the virus, inhibit virus replication, can be a really suitable agent for treating AIDS, or even for that matter for treating HIV infection. Since the immune system does a very good job of keeping the virus replicated at undetectable levels.
On the west and east coasts of the United States, the agony of AIDS, combined with the uncertainties about AZT, have led to the growth of support groups like HEAL, run by Michael Elmer, whose members seek alternative approaches to the treatment of AIDS. HEAL helps people who are suffering side effects come off AZT.
They're scared. They know that they don't like the way that they feel. And we show them other people who come to HEAL. And there's always a good 20 or 30 people who cold turkey AZT. They just stop taking it.
Cliff Goodman has been HIV positive for 4 years. Would you take AZT?
No way. I wouldn't give it to my cats. I would think it was murder. I've seen people go AZT, and I've seen them waste and their hair fall out and their muscles shrivel below their knee, and I've seen many males become impotent. So there's no way I'm going to take something like that. I think it's almost like a punishment.
We'll blame AIDS at all. We really have all. Alan Roundtree had to come off AZT because he felt so ill.
At first, good. Oh boy, I gained weight, and I said, boy, this stuff must be working. And then about another 2 weeks later, it did start working. The headaches came, the dizziness, the nauseousness, and the whole time I had fingernails that were so black, it looked like I had nail polish on, and the upset stomachs, nothing tastes right, food or anything. And the main thing of it, it'll affect you so where you couldn't listen to people because you don't want to hear them because you're hurting so bad. And it left me impudent. It destroyed my hopes for living,
Welcome's AZT promotional leaflet in the UK states,
Zidovudine improves both quality and length of life.
Are there any data to support AZT prolonging life?
I don't think that we have that. The data has been made available, sir. The major problem is that with all the published AZT studies, the studies were prematurely concluded. And what happened to these people after the study was concluded is not very well known, nor is it published anywhere.
Do you believe that AZT prolongs life?
In patients that have advanced disease, yes, that has been shown in numerous studies. When used early, when patients are still asymptomatic, have no symptoms, or they have minimal symptoms and their immune system is not severely damaged, there we know that AZT prevents or delays the occurrence of AIDS, which we felt in the United States was the most important thing to look for.
The claim is made that AZT extends life, and yet most of the beliefs that it does are based on the phase 2 trials, which, as I just said, were seriously flawed, utterly worthless. Other studies used to claim benefits for AZT range all the way from tiny little studies of uncontrolled patients, 5 or 6 here and there, which are really nothing better than anecdotes.
Dr. John Hamilton, at the Veterans Administration Medical Center in North Carolina, is co-chair of one of the longest completed AZT studies, published in the leading American medical journal this week. The drug was given to 338 patients, one group early in the disease, and another when their immune cell count fell below 200. He believes that AZT should be given to people in the latter stages of the disease, but is less certain about giving AZT to people early in the disease.
The results of the trial demonstrated that patients on early therapy had a delay in the progression to AIDS. However, there was no difference in survival comparing one group with the other. That is, the same number of individuals died in each group, and the time at which they died was the same.
Individual people differ greatly in the way they react to drugs, and there's no way of knowing who will suffer severe side effects or tolerate the drug well. Jim Pruitt lives in Miami. He suffered AIDS symptoms since 1986 and took high doses of AZT for a year. He then broke off treatment because of muscle and liver problems and has been on intermittent, much lower doses since then. Although Jim's T-cell count hasn't improved overall since he started on AZT, he says it has improved his quality of life.
I began to feel better. I started gaining weight to weigh. Clinically, I was doing better. My energy level returned.
This was not a response that I think everyone experienced with this drug. But my response was very good.
Gordon, living in central London, has had no problems with AZT. Because he had developed mouth lesions with low blood clotting cells or platelets, he was prescribed 1,000 milligrams of AZT for 18 months. He's now reduced his dose by half.
I do accept that I'm one of the lucky ones. I, of course, accept the evidence that it is not a good drug and that it does have toxicities which can be quite severe. My attitude would be, find out all you can about it. Ideally, talk to someone who has good experience with the drug and to someone who has bad experience with the drug. And then you just have to follow your own instincts.
Cass Mann is a volunteer counsellor for Positively Healthy, the London-based self-help group. It provides members with free information about AIDS and different treatments. Does he think AZT improves quality of life?
No, that is not true. I've never seen it improve the quality of life. Certainly when people begin the drug, they begin with the best possible motive and expectation. But after periods of time, there are of course people who claim it does, but I've known no one who's been on it for an extended period who would claim that.
There has been no formal demonstration of improvement in quality of life. It was assumed that the delay in progression to AIDS would translate into an improved quality of life because it seemed logical and made sense. In fact, the only study that has been done on this point and published, to my knowledge, has failed to demonstrate an improvement in quality of life.
In the UK and US doctors' reference books, there are marked differences in the entries about AZT under its brand name, Ritrobir. For example, in the US entry, there is a section called Information for Patients. There is no such helpful section in the UK datasheet compendium. In this US section, it states that patients should be informed that
the drug has been studied for limited periods of time and that long-term safety and efficacy are not known.
Nowhere does this appear in the UK document. There are other omissions and anomalies. Human rights lawyer Larry Gostin, director of the American Society of Law and Medicine in Boston, believes AZT can benefit people with AIDS, but is concerned that the differences in information discriminate against people in Britain.
In effect, that treats patients in Britain less favorably and with less respect than patients in the United States, and that is wrong. The drug company ought to disclose to physicians, and physicians should disclose to patients all relevant risks, whatever the country may be, whatever the legal system may be.
In West London, Stuart Marshall is also concerned about different standards of information. He's a trustee of Positively Healthy. He knows he's been HIV positive for 8.5 years and has always resisted pressure to AZT. His immune cell or T cell count has quadrupled over the last 4 years and is now between 500 and 600.
When I was offered AZT, I was told nothing at all about side effects. I knew a lot about the side effects because of having a lot of information from America about it. And it's really my opinion, based on a lot of personal experiences, that people are still not being told about the side effects properly. Therefore, I don't think they're able to make a proper informed decision about whether they should take the drug or not.
Currently in the USA, much speculation and concern surrounds possible links between AZT and the emergence of a type of lymphoma, or cancer of the blood, in the late stages of AIDS. This FDA internal document, describing mutating human cells in an AZT laboratory experiment, says,
this behavior is characteristic of tumor cells and suggests that AZT may be a potential carcinogen.
However, Dr. Volberding believes that the lymphomas appearing late in AIDS patients are not associated with AZT.
Appearance of lymphomas in patients receiving antiretroviral therapy is a reflection of the longer duration survival and ability to remain alive, and therefore, unfortunately, at risk for some of these other complications of HIV disease. So we see the lymphomas as an unfortunate reflection of our success at this point, rather than a reason for real caution.
Are you convinced by the explanation that lymphoma is a natural consequence of living longer with AIDS?
No, I'm not. The major reason for that is that almost all the lymphoma that I have seen was a first AIDS event and occurred not at the late stages of the disease, but was the diagnosis that was made that patient an AIDS patient. And prior to AZT coming along, I never saw lymphoma in people who had several opportunistic infections as a late stage event.
In October last year, a new anti-AIDS drug called DDI, with a similar mechanism to AZT, was licensed in the United States under the new fast-track system. In the USA, AZT is now being tested on pregnant women, and London's Great Ormond Street Hospital for Sick Children will soon be part of a European AZT study involving several hundred children and babies. All of this is occurring without any real public debate. Of course, no one should ever change medication, whatever the drug, without proper medical advice. Many AIDS doctors and carers are convinced that particularly in the latter stages of the disease, AZT is invaluable. But some of its greatest exponents are only too aware of its limitations.
Does AZT prevent death? No. Does AZT cure AIDS? No. No one ever said it did. It only works by preventing cells from becoming infected. So therefore, it will have limitations, and we recognize that. And that's why drug development has still surged ahead.
As we've already demonstrated, it's arguable whether AZT can actually prevent cells from becoming infected without killing them as well. So what are we left with? At best, its supporters argue that AZT can delay progression to full-blown AIDS, albeit with side effects.
I think the question really is one of starting the drug before the patient becomes so advanced that the side effects become intolerable. But in terms of long-term administration, I think when the contrast is taking a drug that has some possibility of toxicity versus the certainty of disease progression without the drug, I think most people make the understandable decision to try drug therapy.
But critics of AZT argue that the benefit is not proven.
I would say that in most cases, or in a number of cases, you do see a small increase in T4 cells during the first 3 to 4 months. Usually by 6 to 9 months, if you're lucky by 12 months, you're back to where you started from. And from there on, there's, in most cases, a general decline, so that you end up with T4 cells less than beforehand.
Resistance to calls for more open debate about AZT has come from the US FDA, the medical profession, and the pharmaceutical industry. The FDA and Burroughs Wellcome in the United States, 2 doctors running the current UK Concord trial, and the Wellcome Foundation in the UK have all refused to take part in this program. Wellcome UK said this was because they didn't believe we would be sufficiently balanced and objective in our approach to the subject of AZT to make a reasonable program about it. Last week, Wellcome made another announcement encouraging the wider use of AZT. This letter, issued to doctors in the UK, describes favourable results from a trial in 10 countries involving nearly 1,000 HIV positives without very low immune cell counts. But doctors have been approached before details of the trial have been published in a scientific journal. In the UK, there has been negligible coverage of the issues surrounding AZT. In the USA, however, more voices have been raised. Florida's Miami Herald has kept up a spirited attack on the AZT establishment through journalist Eleanor Burkitt.
The reaction almost universally in the research community and the patient community was hysteria. There was a tremendous sense that I think has happened to journalists all over the world, that by writing such an article, I was being socially irresponsible because I was going to make a group of very sick people stop taking their medication. The fundamental truth of the American research establishment is that the scientific community feels that it shouldn't have to answer to the rest of us. So the notion that a non-scientist would go in and question the
So just as we follow the money with regards to military-industrial complex, important to follow the money in politics in general. Republicans have long been very comfortable with dark money. They've been broadly opposed to any sort of campaign finance reform. They've been happy to have, especially post Citizens United, all of the corporate money and special interest money they possibly can flow into their coffers. Koch Industries, a big benefactor, financing all of these different organizations that funded a bunch of conservative-leaning groups and Republican politicians. All right. Democrats have not only caught up to Republicans in this regard, but they have actually, by some measures, according to the New York Times,
let's say that these are your lungs. This is your right lung. This is your left lung. I'm just going to label them upper, and this will be lower, and this will be the middle lobe. And you're minding your own business, and somebody coughs, and they get TB in your lungs. So that TB gets inhaled, you breathe it in, and the location that the TB likes to go to is actually a pretty interesting thing, is it likes to go along these fissures that I'm drawing out here. So these are the
Plans for today's dreams and all of tomorrow's.
Perhaps the surveillance state where your behaviour is continually monitored and controlled by big tech was some kind of accident. Oh no, we've got the evidence that it was deliberate and planned. Hello there, you 4.7 million shimmering awakening wonders, you glorious fragments of light-made flesh inhabiting this planet so we can have a spiritual experience together. I spoke to Professor Shoshana Zuboff, who is an expert on surveillance tech, and she told me the story of how Google from its inception knew that it would require spying in order to create an effective and profitable generator for themselves, big businesses, and for the government. I had this podcast, Under the Skin, available from Luminary, where every single week I talk to thinkers and academics and outsiders maybe that have interesting opinions and experiences that will help you cultivate a better understanding of reality. In this conversation, Shoshana, whose name I just love saying, Shoshana, we talk about Google's power, how it was created and how it affects you. Stay to the end because I want to know exactly what you think about it.
Fellow named Douglas Edwards, who was Google's first brand manager. And in his book, he has this recollection of Larry Page stating this insight for the first time. And the question, they're sitting around the table, literally, and they're saying, well, what business is Google in? And like, how do we even describe Google to the world? And Larry Page, who was one of Google's founders with Sergey Brin, Larry Page ruminates on this question, and he says, this is the year 2001, he says, if we did have a category, a business category, it would be personal information. Because everything that you do, everything that you say, everywhere that you go, every place that you've been, every aspect of your experience is going to be searchable, indexable. We will be able to know it all. And at that moment, it became clear that while Google was marketing itself as a search engine muscle, and we thought that we searched Google, even as early as 2001, those young men understood that they had to reverse the entire process, that it was not users searching Google, it was Google searching users. The search engine worked in reverse, and that was the source of its breakthrough insight that founded surveillance capitalism, because they understood right from the start that they could not do this in a way that people would be aware of, that it had to be hidden, because users would not allow themselves to be searched, and lawmakers would be triggered into passing privacy laws. And so right from the start, they had something that they called the hiding strategy. Famously, if you've ever been to Google headquarters over in Mountain View, California, in the lobby there's this kind of ticker tape, and it's a constant viewing of things that are going through the search engine right at that moment, right? So Russell Brand's podcast and weather tomorrow, all of the things, you know, the good, the bad, and the ugly that people search on. And Douglas Edwards recounts how, again, Larry Page wanted them to dismantle that ticker tape in the lobby because he was afraid that it gave away too much of what Google could actually be learning about from everybody's searching activities. And he didn't want anyone to have any idea, not citizens and not lawmakers, of exactly how much data they were able to gather and how much they were able to learn about us and predict about us from analyzing, computing those data. This is the birthplace of artificial intelligence as currently used today. So surveillance, this surveillance piece, Russell, is wholly digital century, unimaginable without the digital, unimaginable without digital technology. That we produce data, human generated data, that we leave traces behind, that they can find them, that they can analyze them. All of that is unprecedented. What else is unprecedented? That this kind of data surveillance would be applied to aspects of our experience that until the year 2000, we considered to be private. So secretly, they invaded and extracted aspects of human experience that everyone believed were private. And because they did it in ways that were hidden, and even if you happened to find them, they were indecipherable, inscrutable, you could never know about it. Nobody knew about it. Nobody understood it. And so, even though there is continuity with the history of capitalism, modification of them to bamboozle, confuse, gaslight their way through 20 years, confusing and misdirecting lawmakers around the world as well as citizens. And only now, it's really only in the past approximately 3 to 4 years, Russell, that the world is waking up to the atrocities that have been committed now, not just at the very beginning, which is the original sin, but all through the various milestones that have been reached, the stages of evolution across these 20 years is a mounting narrative of atrocity and tragedy. And I'll complete the thought with one final sentence that moves back to your original question. Why should we care? Why should we be aroused? Why should we be mobilized? Why should we be indignant? And the reason is that this new institutional order has always been and is now on a collision course with democracy. Democracy is the only existing institutional order with the countervailing authority, with the requisite power to obstruct, to contradict, to outlaw. surveillance capitalism.
My favourite bit about that video is when Shoshana talks about the way that they thought about taking that ticker thing down in the Google building, the way that they realised that what were ghost fragments of data would one day become the surveillance capitalist nightmare that we're currently inhabiting. I also like the idea that this is something that we could change if we could ever regain control of our governments. Do you think that's possible? Can democracy ever again be real? With the political parties we have? Do we have to create new political parties? Let me know in the comments below what you think we should do to change our world. A real democracy would involve conversation, would involve your feelings, your spirit, your mind being engaged on these topics. Let me know. Who else you want to see me talking to? Give this video a thumbs up if you like it. If you enjoyed this video, have a little look at this one or this one over on my Awakening channel. Together on this journey, if we remained awakened, perhaps we can possibly stay free.
And we can build.
What's up, girl?
What up?
Being fat.
Being fat.
I forgot to put the food in. It should be that. Is it
Gonna
good?
get all of my shit if you don't knock anything over with your own stuff.
Sorry, I couldn't hear you in the process of me knocking things over.
You should be
Sassy mouth.
sassy now. Hello.
Hi. Disgruntled. Llama, what are you looking at? Said llama to me, quick tap chat thing.
How long the hats? No.
Llama drama.
Roll drama indeed. Oh, that's very cold. I'm so cold.
Big girl. Big girl. Yeah. She's a big girl. And in the box. Yeah.
I want to cut you some yet.
So did you like the chicken, how it was?
Yeah, it's good.
I filleted it
Filleted.
or whatever.
Fancy.
Butterflied it.
Fancy.
I just cut it in half so it made it thinner.
Huh.
I just put soy sauce in there to make it sticky, make it taste Chinese. It's Chinese rice.
Oh, yeah.
But
If you get hungry, there's hot dogs there.
I'm okay. I thought fucking packet food. You guys are obsessed with food.
Is it like,
What?
Do you like the stir fry or is too much?
No, there's a lot.
Okay.
There's a lot in there.
We'll wrap it up.
Yeah, I guess so.
Oh no! You fell off the box.
Yeah.
Did you fall off the box? Yeah. Oh. Clones me. Yeah, you just your bed. You have to sleep in the socks. You have to sleep in the socks and bed.
Oh, and people's door. It's fucking very cold.
It's like, well, this one is almost fucking sick. Like, it's my back itchy though.
What? Hello. So,
One. Good fat.
huh?
Chilling.
Don't even.
Don't even what?
Oh god. Oh god. Chris is ready.
I'm gonna walk with things sometimes.
Sometimes. Oh my god. Really?
Leo Vegas presents an exclusive selection of blackjack tables for you. Now, streamed live from our very Wow, that right there is a major trucker protest happening right now in Canada that has raised over $4 million to fight the Canadian government, a story that you're hearing very little about. Welcome back, beautiful, amazing human beings. This is Luke Nesky here. We are James and Eric, and we got a lot of very important information to get into, as of course there's more troubling developments geopolitically, especially with American foreign policy, as our leaders are literally stuffing their face with ice cream. We're going to be talking about that, plus a lot more important international news, as of course there's a major movement underway. What are they protesting? What are they going? Of course, what some people have called the Great Reset, or, the consortium of globalist, Davos-attending, super wealthy technocrats that literally are trying to impose their vision of how they want the world to be to you. Is it a theory that these individuals and how the World Economic Forum, quote, penetrated over half of the cabinets of governments in France and Canada, and how they're trying to infiltrate other governments. And they even getting when their people were in government. And when you look at those particular governments, they are dealing with massive protests that, of course, are against these types of draconian governments that, of course, disrespect the will of the human. Canada, you have to be accompanied by a staff member in a store in order to make sure that you're complying with the totalitarian whims of the government there and their domestic passport system. This is an Orwellian form of leadership, which perfectly represents what these guys want to achieve. Other countries who don't follow in these same footsteps, they get threatened, they get extorted. There's economic hitman turned against them, as of course, right now the IMF is urging El Salvador to remove Bitcoin as legal tender, and the society that they are trying to create is, of course, the one already in existence in China, a country that, of course, tightly controls everything in the way people exist and live their lives, to the point where they are literally editing out new endings of movies like Fight Club that literally get rid of the larger anarchistic message of that movie. And it's not Fight Club they're after, they're also after Keanu Reeves, who's facing a major Chinese boycott right now, as of course he is going to be participating in an upcoming benefit for Tibet. When you look at China, this is what reverse statists in the United States want for you, your family, and your children, and they do it every step of the way with fourth, fifth generational warfare that is conducted against you in many ways where you don't even know you are the larger victim of it. Again, I have a lot more to say about this, and I am specifically going to be talking about this agenda as well as what's happening to our children on LukeUncensored.com in a brand spanking new video coming out later on today on our own platform where we get to say and do what we want. And holy cow, the stories that we want to cover are absolutely groundbreaking and sadly contain bigger truths, which we can't even mention here on this platform. Again, lots to talk about. Don't forget to sign up and join our platform right now on LukeUncensored.com. And if you want to support us in other ways, another one is by simply checking out our t-shirt store, thebestpoliticalshirts.com, where you can get shirts like the one I'm wearing right now, standing in solidarity with the Canadian truckers, declaring that people should say no to the Great Reset. Those shirts are also available down in the description below. Now, I think it's very fair to assume that there has been a concerted effort trying to push the United States in a conflict with Russia for a very long time. There's a lot of voices, whether neoconservative or neoliberal, that have been advocating for this for a very long time. But I think people fail to realize how absolutely dramatically catastrophic that would be, not only for, of course, Ukraine, that's being used as a proxy for all of this, but of course also for the rest of Europe, and also, of course, the United States, especially when you consider the absolute incompetent and corrupt leadership that we have in the West right now. We have an absolute investigating a corrupt energy company where his son sat on the board of, probably even bragging about it. When you have leadership like that, you have leadership that does not give a damn about the people that they are serving, but of course their own special interests. And there are a lot of special interests that are set to gain throughout all of this, especially with the more disastrous that it turns out to be for everyone else. The Biden administration is making very strong statements about our duty, our responsibility in protecting the borders of Ukraine. Meanwhile, they don't even respect the borders of their own country. Now, diplomatically, things have broken down to the point where now the Biden administration sent a letter to Russia instead of course, holding face-to-face meetings. This letter is a proposal to Russia on a path forward. What's exactly in that letter? Well, we don't know yet, but I think it's fair to say that this administration's foreign policy has been absolutely atrocious and extremely counterintuitive to not only American interests, but of course to the interests that they say that they want to protect. Look at Afghanistan as a perfect example of this, but still, there are some bureaucrats, statists within our government that are demanding war no matter matter what the consequences of. Not surprisingly, even a lot of Republican legislators that are essentially demanding that there should be blood. The Biden administration is also making a lot of promises that it cannot keep, since, of course, if there is a conflict between the East and the West, even in a proxy state, Russia will, of course, most likely use their gas supply as a bargaining chip and most likely turn off the gas, the energy for the rest of Europe, since Europe is dependent on Russian energy, especially since, of course, many countries like Germany have pledged to get rid of their nuclear power plants, all in the name of helping the environment, as, of course, they keep buying more and more Russian energy that, of course, is significantly way worse off for the environment. Again, what Germany here is doing is absolutely nonsensical and ridiculous. But if there is a proxy war, a limited war, this would, of course, leave a lot of people in Europe stranded. That he has a plan to help supply Europe of natural gas if Vladimir Putin cuts off their supply, and that's a lie. It's impossible for the U.S. president to do so, not only because of the difficult distance between the United States and Europe, but because we have another major lie by this administration trying to cover up its incompetency by being more incompetent. Winter months in Europe without heat, without energy, also signal other turn of events like China seeking an opportunity to go after Taiwan. All of this would have huge negative ramifications to the United States and their world hegemony, and also the financial are in a very serious downswing. This, along with trillions of dollars of debt that's unpayable, is something that, of course, could lead to another financial economic crisis that would hit the entire world. But still, the U.S. administration isn't unfazed here, as they just announced thousands of troops to be put on heightened alert. The Biden to get more military personnel near Russia, as of course everyone's watching by as this insanity unfolds, as of course it's a guessing game to see what will happen from here. Again, the situation is very dynamic, it's changing very fast, but it's something that of course we should be keeping an eye on and trying to hope for the best, calling for diplomacy, which there still is a possibility of unfolding. I agree Kissinger doctrine, and of course this would be a perfect distraction towards the world realizing that they were just conned. But that's just my perspective. I hope I'm wrong. If you think I am, let me know down in the comment section below. Truly another vital, dangerous situation that we're all in, as we're all on edge, waiting to find out what happens to these sociopaths in power. So, fair to say, I'm not reassured. I got a lot more to say about this, plus a lot more. I'm going to be doing that later on today on LukeSensitive.com. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you guys watching, sharing them out there to the general public, and because you do, I'm still here. This is why I love you guys. Stay tuned for more here on WeAreChange.org.
Tonight, millions of Americans still digging out from that deadly winter blast as another major storm takes aim. The record-breaking nor'easter dropping more than 2 feet of towns completely flooded, homes covered in ice. At least 4 people killed. Another system now brewing, more than 30 million Americans under alert from Colorado to Michigan. We'll have to track. Also tonight, rising tensions over the buildup of Russian troops at the Ukrainian border. American and Russian diplomats in a heated sparring match at the UN. Both sides are chasing the other, escalating the crisis, creating hysteria. President Biden weighing in late today. Trump offers pardons to former president, promising to pardon anyone who took part in the Capitol riot last January if he runs for president and is re-elected in 2024. A comment sparking outrage from Republicans and Democrats alike. Even one of Trump's closest allies now speaking out against the idea. Spotify uproar. Joe Rogan speaking out amid mounting calls for Spotify to remove him from its platform. A controversial podcaster accused of spreading COVID misinformation. The artist not claiming that music from the Afghan podcast growing larger by the day. But Miss USA death is honoring for a former beauty queen after her apparent death by suicide in New York City. what she wrote in her final Instagram post just hours before her death. And baby on board, a passenger going into labor in the middle of an 11-hour flight, the crew stepping up to help her. An incredible delivery, more than 35,000 feet in the sky. Top Story starts right now.
There's a reason why you don't need a backyard in Montreal. It's because you have
Plans for today's dreams and all of
Yes, it's another video about Joe Rogan as he addresses the misinformation controversy that threatens to have him pulled from Spotify. We ask, are some types of misinformation more deadly than other types of misinformation? And are some people's journey through life, sometimes there is doubt, but after that doubt there will be more light, more awakening yet to come. This we can undertake together if we're willing to be forgiving and engage with one another in polite, open conversations, not fleeing to the margins, hurling rocks at one another across a perpetual divide. Particularly if you ever suspect that these divisions be a deliberate part of a plan to prevent us coming together, then see how those points and that deluge of information, that barrage of platitudes I just bombarded you with, relate to the Joe Rogan story. Let's break it down. Obviously, what you know has happened is Joe Rogan had some guests on his podcast that spoke about coronavirus, mandates, vaccines, etc. Now, of course, Joe Rogan, whether or not as a response to Spotify or as a response to his own feelings, has apologised. So that's the end of that, in a way, isn't it? He said, all right, I'll feel better now. So let's have a look at what else is going on around this subject and what it tells us. Before we do that, let's look at the timeline. 2 weeks ago, 270 doctors demanded Spotify censor Joe Rogan and take action against the mass misinformation. Now, remember that, and obviously you now know that many of those people were doctors. One person was a vet, I love vets. Another person was a podcaster, I love podcasters. But it's because one person was a vet, I love vets. Another person was a podcaster, I love podcasters. But it's weird, it shows that there's an agenda at play, even presenting them as doctors, and then they're not doctors. That's the management of information. That's what we're talking about here. The management of information. Which stories are amplified? Which stories are ignored? Has there been misinformation elsewhere across the course of the pandemic? I mean, just run your own mental check here. Do you remember ever being told anything during this pandemic? Neil Young demanded his music be pulled from Spotify. Other artists joined, such as Joni Mitchell. Heart-wrenching, really. Because like, these are all people that don't be totally like Neil Young. I'm old enough to sort of love Neil Young and Joni Mitchell. So like, I'm like, oh no. The hashtag delete Spotify and Spotify delete is trending. That's going to scare them. But what will scare them at Spotify even more? Share price fell. It lost over $2 billion in market value. One thing people don't like a big business stock is people taking their money. Amazon and Apple Music have since flaunted support for Neil Young with special deals and playlists. Now, you might have seen the brilliant Breaking Points video where Kristen and Sagat talk about the financial interest catalogue stuff. There's a huge value in these things, so it's not straightforward matter of principles. I'm making no accusations saying around heroes like Neil Young and Joni Mitchell. But now let's look at rules and ethics, and those things that you barely noticed when someone tries to use it against you as a weapon. Young said of Amazon, all listeners to Amazon Music will automatically get 4 months free. Amazon has been leading the pack in bringing high-res audio to the masses, and it's a great place to enjoy my entire catalogue in the highest quality available. Luckily, there are no side effects like Amazon's advice are perfect, most of all myself. But if what you have is a kind of ideological agenda, then surely, when you're talking about Amazon, you're going to have a little bit of rest. It's about banging the drum. To be like, also though, the songs that I sang for years and years that directly address Simplify. Just over a year ago, Young based investment fund in a deal worth deployed $150 million. In 2021, Hypnosis Song Management launched a $1 billion. In 2021, Hypnosis Song Management launched a $1 billion partnership with Blackstone, the investment company, currently buying up entire American neighborhoods, pushing up prices, and in turn, preventing families owning their home. Okay, in a sense, it's difficult, isn't it? You've really got to choose your battles, and even specifically on the subject of misinformation, and even specifically on the subject of misinformation around this peculiar, traumatizing pandemic, you've got to be careful about misinformation. Stay with this video right to the end, because we're going to look at where else you might have seen misinformation over the complex arc of the last couple of years. Pfizer. I've heard of that. Does Pfizer have any interest in a particular? No, sorry, I'm sidetracked.
I think if there's anything that I've done that I could do better is have more experts with differing opinions right after I have the controversial ones. I would most certainly be open to doing that. And I would like to talk to some people that have differing opinions on those podcasts in the future.
I suppose Joe Rogan has got to take us on board. Some of you might think, if you're an ardent Joe Rogan fan, oh man, he's changed his position, he's selling out. But actually, what Joe Rogan's doing is he's emerging into a pretty unique, unique territory that now is going to place unique demands on him as the sort of nexus of corporate, political, medical demands all intersect. My personal opinion, and I don't want to believe lightly, is that you want to hear everybody. And like what Joe Rogan's come from is literally saying on his own to something that now is sort of setting the news agenda around the world. So obviously that would require adjustment for anybody who finds themselves in that position.
So my pledge to you is that I will do my best to try to balance out these more controversial viewpoints with other people's perspectives so we can maybe find a better point of view.
Also, what Joe Rogan's saying is that I'm willing to evolve and change and pursue something better. You never see the mainstream media address something in this manner. That's why Joe Rogan is so popular. Joe Rogan's not a bloody news channel. It's a podcast conversation, for one thing. So comparing it directly to science is a bit unfair. And comparing it to mainstream media, and we know where they're funded and what their agenda can often be regarded as, that's already an unfair comparison. Now have a look at this. This is Rachel Maddow talking about vaccinations earlier in the pandemic. Now let me be clear here. I have absolutely no opinion on your life and your medical procedures. Of course I don't. Why would I? What do I know? What could I claim to know? I've never been to university or higher education of any kind, except for showing off school, which I think is pretty apparent. Now, Rachel Maddow here, while towing the official line, and what was believed an interesting conspiracy completely out of this. This is Rachel Maddow saying, get vaccinated. Once you're vaccinated, the virus stops. The virus can no longer transmit.
Now we know that the vaccines work well enough that the virus stops with every vaccinated person. A vaccinated person gets exposed to the virus. The virus does not infect them. The virus cannot then use that person to go anywhere else.
Now that's not true. Maybe Rachel Maddow, and here's what I would say, Rachel Maddow, at the time she said it, believed it was true. So cool. Forgive Rachel Maddow for making this mistake. Rachel Maddow is a human being, but she said something that's not true. That's misinformation. That's the same thing. She said it on the news. Are you going to see that? Are you going to see, hey, listen, we were wrong about that, we were wrong about that, we were wrong about that? See, in a sense, it doesn't really matter. As Lord Bernard Shaw said, it's not whether you treat people well or treat people badly, but that you treat everybody the same. Now, I would prefer to treat people well. But the idea that you've got a principle, a guiding line, is necessary, because otherwise what happens is the most powerful interests in the world just dominate the way narratives go, and when you start realizing there are financial undertones to any particular story, it's impossible to extract them from the outcome of the narrative, from the intention of the story. So again, I'm not criticizing Rachel Maddow or Joe Rogan. Like, these are all people, human beings, like you and me, living in the world. What I'm saying is when there's an agenda or a sort of an intention, let's look at what the component parts could be. That's the purpose of our channel. Not to tell you what to do with your life, not to tell you what to believe in, what not to do, or what to do, just to say, what might this be? Together, 4.8 million of us, maybe we can get somewhere. You'll love this piece by Branko Markotic in Jacobin, talking about Joe Rogan's challenges here. If we were being honest about the situation, we'd admit that Rogan's just one of many purveyors of COVID misinformation, and that the others include a who's who of liberal politicians, public health officials, and mainstream press outlets, the very sources told are the most trustworthy of mainstream voices on the pandemic, and who are pointing the finger at Rogan now. From the very start, the messaging on the pandemic from media became the most important thing in the world. Everyone knew masks were useless at wearing, until everyone knew it was the opposite. Do you personally remember each one of those pivots? I do, and I'm not suggesting that there's anything malfeasant occurring. But if you can track that misinformation and then track the interests of certain powerful groups, and if you were to see a corollary, that would be interesting, I suppose. Some of this owed to the initial lack of information about the virus, as well as its constantly evolving nature. So, you can imagine them defending it. Yeah, we didn't know that then. Oh, what? But Joe Rogan's got to be perfect. But as that last entirely unforced error by public health experts show, far too much of it wasn't. There are too many instances of this incessant intellectual whiplash to list, especially in the United States. Public health experts overwhelmingly agreed a national stay-at-home order was needed to stop the virus, until the liberal science-believing candidate they backed won and ruled it out, at which point they never mentioned it again. Trump's pledge to roll out a vaccine within a year was an objective falsehood to the point it was fact-checked at the time, only for media outlets to criticise him for rolling it out too slowly once exactly that happened. His challenger's liberal running mate publicly aired a vaccine hesitancy talking point, an attitude that has become unconscionable and beyond the pale among her supporters once she entered the White House. So, again, this is what this channel is for, to help us understand together how truth is used, which types of truth or information are promoted, and which types of truth are embargoed, which type of people are sanctioned to communicate, which kind of people are censored from communicating. That's one thread of information that you can look at and follow. Like, this is happening to this person for saying that. This is happening to this person for saying that. Oh, nothing's happening to this person for saying that. Joe Biden spread pandemic misinformation on CNN as president and all but declared independence from the virus in a major speech just as a new, more dangerous strain took hold in the country. More than once, his administration has claimed basics like sending tests to American homes is impossible, only to reverse itself and to do that very thing. I'm not even, as a little person, criticising Joe Biden for that. I'm saying, oh, wow, maybe one thing was possible, then another thing became possible. So, Joe Rogan there saying, oh, yeah, all right, I won't do that again, I'll do this. Cool, that's the end of it, right? So let's see if that's how it plans out. The government's top science advisor, Anthony Fauci, you love that guy, right? So after refusing to do so, the move led to lower mask uptake overall, and for state governments to scramble to update their policies with many relaxing mandates before the CDC reversed itself again a couple of months later, under criticism it was out of step with other expert bodies. Since then, the CDC halved the isolation period for those who caught COVID, making the US quarantine period completely out of step with other countries. Let's be honest with ourselves, has Rogan's podcast really done more to damage public trust in scientific research and so doubt in the credibility of medical advice than this non-exhaustive list of own goals from experts? As always, censorship and similarly heavy-handed measures are the desperate resort of someone who refuses or has simply given up on tackling the root causes of a problem. The liberal cause for internet censorship as a means for dealing with the virus has been a depressing staple of the US pandemic response. Meanwhile, the structural factors that keep people mistrustful of public health, a private insurance-based healthcare system, a lack of money and time, decades of neoliberal policy go largely unmentioned. Just as well, otherwise people will actually start demanding some serious changes to the US economy. So there's a whole distraction component to this as well. Have a look at the video we made about underfunding in US hospitals and how that narrative is never promoted. If Spotify boomed Rogan and the US government banished him to the Arctic, you would still get mistrust. Demand that Rogan be censored if you like, as illiberal as that is. But let's not pretend it's a solution. There, in fact, is the thrust of this story. Joe Rogan, by his own admission, on camera, said he don't do this. The mainstream media and the government itself and government-funded agencies are responsible for misinformation, pivots, contradictions, hypocrisy. That's all just been laid out for you. Not to mention, you've experienced it. You don't need the media or me to tell you that. Remember, you're like, okay, well, that happened, they said this and they said that. They told me this and they told me that. You remember all that stuff, right? So, If it really is about misinformation, let's treat everyone's misinformation in the same way. Otherwise, conclusions could be drawn that some misinformation is valuable and important and helps the interests of the powerful, so it's never addressed, never ever excluded, never edited or censored, whereas other misinformation is a problem. And you decide for yourself what might be causing that. We'll put a link in the description to Sang and Crystal's video. We'll put a link in the description to this article and Jacobin, and you can have a look at those things for yourself, and you can have a look at the videos that we've done. Me, personally, I say open conversation, willingness to hear all sides, and remembering that these divisions are artificial. We've all got sons and daughters and uncles and aunts and friends and brothers and cousins that have all sorts of different ways of identifying around every single issue, and we love them because they're human. We don't want homogeneity, heterogeneity, sameness. We want a varied, diverse, inclusive, open, friendly, beautiful society where people can be who they actually are. And if you think that censoring Joe Rogan is in the service of that idea rather than in the service of financial interests, then let me know in the comments below and help me to understand that, because I must say, that's not how I see it. But that's just what I think. Again, let me know what you think in the comments below. Give us a like, subscribe to my channel. We're chasing that 5 million number. We're so close, 4.8 million. Imagine the day where I go 5 million glorious wonders. Won't that be a joy? Have a look at the videos that I've recommended to you. Sign up to my mailing list so I can communicate with you continually. Tell me about my live shows in March and April. Have a look at the link in the description. We can talk about the last couple of years. Connected as one. Stay free.
Zero sugar, zero calories. Stevia, live your best.
For which I wrote the forward exactly.
Oh, that's nice. I will get on well. Yes, you did the forward. I did the afterward. Let's call the whole thing off. Obviously, you've noticed that when you use WhatsApp, you have to sort of sign up to some contract that seems like it's obfuscating and bizarre. And if you notice, when you search anything on Google now, you've got to tap down through that contract, agreeing to all sorts of nation where I didn't speak the language. You know, what's going on? Well, of course, what's happening is I'm agreeing to hand over my privacy. You will love this great reset video where we see Klaus Schwab in the flesh, in person, talking to the head of Microsoft. So you don't hear about much with regard to privacy, as if they're almost a blue chip company beyond reproach. Well, I argue in this video that that's because they are the OG, the original gangster of the big tech world. And the reason you don't see them all before Congress is they've simply mastered the art of treachery. Let's look at privacy, big tech, the Great Reset, and make sure that Klaus Schwab doesn't actually look like a Bond villain.
Now, one of the key issues in this, in the economy of today is how we handle data.
I'm going to need you to look at the camera and say, Mr. Bond has been expecting you while stroking at least an imaginary cat.
And I think it was you who at least you spoke out for data dignity. And of course we have a tension. How much do we protect privacy? How much do we use the potential of those data for good?
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it, the Great Reset? If there were a fundamental problem with Davos, which is seen as the central summit behind the Great Reset idea, it's that they're always talking about stuff as if they're going to do stuff, when you think actually there's some other plan in mind. To see Klaus Schwab and Satya Nadella talking about privacy and data dignity, it's theatre. It's theatre because the number of powerful interests that are cooperating and collaborating at Davos and through the relationships established there and demonstrated there could change the world whenever they wanted. Recent behaviour within big tech companies like the Trump ban, for example, show the real power is with big tech and with these kind of organisations. So I suppose it's particularly galling to hear them talk about potential regulation or change as if they're going to do something, as if there's any consideration other than the perpetuation of the ideas that underwrite their companies.
I think we believe
that data and privacy around data is a human right. It has to be protected. You have to be transparent. Scott Galloway, a professor at New York University's Stern School of Business, which had two theories to even get the head around, well, probably the Stern School of Business. They're the original gangster of big tech, known for sucking the air supply from their competition. In the 90s, Netscape with implicit subsidies. Had the DOJ not put the brakes on Microsoft, we might not have had Google today favouring Bing as the dominant search engine. Don't even think about Bing anymore, do you? I don't even know what it is. I'm a cartoon rabbit like kids watching the telly. Last year it was revealed that 250 million Microsoft customer records spanning 14 years have been exposed online without password protection. I never trust that little paperclip guy. Windows 10 is criticised by launch for having default settings that send various information regarding user behaviours to Microsoft's trusted partners. Just partners. Now, here's the interesting thing. I think that this term I like, which we use for data dignity. I don't like data dignity. It sounds sort of like a bit stupid, actually. Excuse me, where's my data dignity? How dare you look at my bike with bot and my digitally do? Goes one step further than privacy. Because data that you contribute to the world is got utility. Microsoft sells targeted ads against search results, and users have complained about how their data is secured in the cloud. But the company has received nearly the same level of scrutiny, and it's been years since its executives were pulled before Congress. It's good that in this industry, having not been pulled before Congress for a few years is seen as a good thing. Hey, it's been ages before I've been pulled before Congress. Jennifer King, Director of Consumer Privacy at the Centre for Internet and Society, Stanford Law School, said, "They've been around the block. They've been the evil perpetrator before, and they've already learned how to play very nicely with the regulators. Now they understand how to grease the wheels of the political machine." That's one of the reasons you don't see Microsoft executives being pulled into Congress. They've been in this space for decades. So the point is that Microsoft, who of course are in the news a lot because of their former CEO, Bill Gates, are under a little bit of scrutiny, revealed to be not more ethical, not more clean with regard to their practices around privacy and profit, just finer grained way. How my data is being used to create both utility for me and the world and the causes I care about. I like that Satya Nadella is talking there like he isn't the CEO of Microsoft, but just some guy and using the internet. I can have my dignity preserved. My data should be spotted. Well, you do that, mate. You're in charge of Microsoft. And could you go one step further and you could see something? I just didn't see expression. I don't know whether it has been used. The data wallet for everybody. So, a data what? What wallet? What? That's going to take a while. Actually, if you look at Klaus Schwab's face, he's a little bit like a country old granddad. But we're not judging people by their faces or their voices, other than trying to get the laugh and a joke. What we are interested in is whether or not that box is being used to provide a platform for some of the most powerful interests in the world to mask their true intentions behind a veil of conviviality, normalness, and ordinariness. But in fact, what's happening is power is being concentrated into sort of like a uranium pellet of potency. So he can decide whether he actually sells the data. Did you know as well that Microsoft owns LinkedIn, which has raised eyebrows with his uncanny skills of possessing connections with 600 million users, and was probed in Ireland for using email addresses of 80 million non-members to buy targeted ads on Facebook? It seems, again, that what distinguishes Microsoft from Facebook and other big tech companies is not that their behaviour is better, but that they are more deft in their duplicity. They have better legal advice. They've been in the game longer. They know how to avoid these kind of problems. They've got lobbying relationships that go back longer. They have more influence. They're able to protect, although those investigations may ultimately prove to be what we see conducted with, for example, Zuckerberg at Facebook. Absolutely. I mean, I think that these are the kind of mechanisms we should be experimenting with. Which today, if you think about the exchange, what is ad-funded business model? And by the way, ad funding is not a bad business model because in some sense you're getting a free service. Well, certainly seems to be working quite well for all of the major tech companies in the world, because that's what they are. That's what Facebook is, that's what Google is. They're all ad-based business models for all their ingenuity in the forward-facing aspect of their business, and the presentation is like these friendly, multicolored, in their font, jocular organizations. Ultimately, they're selling bespoke adverts to their users. We know the old adage: if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. And in the case of all these free services, that's what's happening. Cue advert.
We have set aside, we have defined a set of principles around fairness, around robustness, around privacy, security, transparency.
As Satya outlines there, they have themselves outlined a lot of principles around fairness, etc. Well, they're outlining them themselves. It's not unlike the Facebook kangaroo court that banned Donald Trump. If the only measure by which your standards are examined is established by yourself, you're doing what you want anyway. We've established standards around fairness. Well, mate, like according to what law? According to what independent adjudicator? I suppose what Microsoft shows you is that Facebook and Google were the tipping point that took big tech power to egregious and observable levels. But it has long been present, even in the tech world, in the form of Microsoft. So they've long been preying on data and exploiting information that ought to remain private. They've just been doing it better and for longer. And furthermore, they've been exploiting the kind of economic and political relationships that we've come to recognise as fundamental
Of the models that are created and accountability. But it's not just words. Although there's a lot of principles now that are being discussed every day, you need to turn it into software engineering practice.
At Davos, which is committed to improving the state of the world, it's sort of a very banal piece of propaganda that hangs on that wall, committed to improving the state of the world. But can you imagine what that would look like in terms of inequality? What that would look like in terms of privacy, in terms of profit, in terms of business practice more broadly? All have become accustomed to being used to mask true intentions, over which we have little access and no control.
Economic growth will only happen if two other things are also in place for achieving more. One is trust in technology.
You've got to trust the old technology. You've got to trust it. That's one of the keystones of profitability in this area. But in 2013, the Guardian and Washington Post revealed that Microsoft was the first company to participate in the prison surveillance program. The very first one. Yeah, we'll do it. But then you want to wait, see what's going on. No, definitely, we're up for it. Of course, is what Edward Snowden exposed, the scale of surveillance and data sharing that was taking place at Ireland government. Microsoft is a long-term government contractor. The US Army used Microsoft technology to increase lethality by enhancing the ability to detect, decide, and engage before the enemy. Well, that's a bit dodgy, isn't it? Again, you notice how these companies are branded, logical, rational. But much of the violence we see enacted, drone strike kid, drone strikes, specificity, and the participation in that kind of activity certainly makes me question the credibility of a company and certainly the claims they make right now. So, fairness, for example.
The one way we can, in fact, not only have economic growth, lack of economic growth, we can go backwards, is if we don't have trust in the very factor of production that's supposed to fuel the fourth industrial revolution.
Microsoft beat Amazon to win the contract for the Joint Enterprise Defense Infrastructure, the JEDI project, a $10 billion contract to provide cloud services for the Department of Defense. Microsoft's government contract has sparked criticism among employees across the sector. A blog post written by company staffers urged company management not to bid on the JEDI project. You don't need to bid on the JEDI project. This is not the job we are looking for.
Whether it's cyber, whether it's privacy, we talked about AI ethics, internet safety, these are all big topics where we will need global norms to ensure that there is trust. For creators, we'll have to do our part.
When we're contemplating the reorganization of the world, it's not that new ideas are needed that affect their life. All of these ideas are out there, they're just sort of corralled, emptied of meaning, and reissued to you as static, bland, empty sentiments and sentences, while the true, brutal, astute, and powerful are enjoyed in the same way that they always have been. It's the same as it always was. Along the way, we'll absorb it and we'll justify it retrospectively. That's the mentality, and all the conferences and lovely posters and sets that look like a neural network, that's all just ingenious ways of masking tyranny.
Both the United States and China and the European Union having a set of principles that govern what this technology can mean in our lives is probably more in need today than it was in the last 30 years.
Thanks to you.
I feel two revolutions which will take place using digitalization. Data are probably still in many industry sectors, particularly also in education.
You keep away from the food, you keep away from the children, all right, Klaus?
We are still very, let's say, backwards-oriented.
Right, precision agriculture.
It's a podcast. Don't look around there, or should be, or no, I've said too much. We want to be in charge of the kidneys and the cannons. Why did you do it, Klaus? Where's my bloody kid?
Precision agriculture, precision medicine, whether it's digital manufacturing, everything is going to be defined by this fourth industrial revolution. But if you sort of say, what's behind the fourth industrial revolution? You've written the book, for which I wrote the foreword. Exactly.
Oh, it's nice. I will get on well. Yes, you did the foreword, I did the afterword. Let's call the whole thing off. You little cozy Davos buddy.
The fundamental thing that you're seeing is the increasing digitization of people, places, and things. Now, once you have this valuable resource, digital, you can start doing things you can't do with atoms. You can do with bits. In fact, you can make your atoms more efficient.
You leave our atoms and our carrots and our kids alone.
Because you can simulate, you can predict, you can automate all in software. And I think that's the broad phenomenon. Same thing with precision agriculture. The fact that you can pick the seeds, the time to put them, how to maximize or minimize the water usage, all can effectively be designed like how you would design a semiconductor.
Well, have a little listen to Ramdana Shiva. It will tell you how appreciated Bill Gates' involvement in Indian agriculture. See, or look at Bill Gates' programs for acquiring farmland. And look, too, at how cozily it is discussed as if this isn't it, as if it isn't upon us, this terrifying blanketing out of options and rights and freedom and individual expression. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. It really helps the circulation of the video. You know why. I'll put it on the side. Check what this is about, for heaven's sake. If you've got any love fun, leave those comments below. I do read them. If you're worried about dress sense or something, or anything that's bothering you, just put it down there in the comments. It'll get to me. And please, don't sign up to our mailing list. I've got some important announcements coming up soon I really want to involve you with. Thanks for watching it. Let us know what you guys see coming. Thank you.
So the interaction with philosophy, I think Christianity is trying to integrate agape and logos together. That's how I try to understand this project. And please clarify that, Clean. Sure. So I think, we've talked a lot about the Greek heritage of logos, and logos is also central within, especially in the book of John. Yeah, especially in the book of John. And saying that metaphorically with regard to you as well. But also in the epistle of John is where John also said God is agape. Right? And that's the epistle of John. He makes that famous statement. And the idea is there's something about the way the logos gathers things together so they belong together. That's the original. So that everything comes together. Everything comes together. And then there's the idea in Plato of the ascent from the cave, the anagogy. You and Jonathan talked about this. The world discloses itself to me, that transforms me, and then I can see more deeply into the world, that transforms me, and I do this reciprocal opening. And the thing is, that's very much, you define that, that's love. Yeah, accelerated mutual disclosure is how it's even disclosed. Well, it seemed to me that the relationship between truth and love is that love is something like the goal, and truth is its servant. It seems to me to be so, because so this is how I've worked it in my mind. Well, I think that truth is the best servant of reality. Truth is the servant of reality, and reality, I think, best manifests itself as love. The
form. You're tying that to that revelation of the form and that conforming.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. That's exactly it. It's and this is very similar to the Buddhist idea of that what you're trying to do is shape attention and mindfulness so that you get that reciprocal opening, so that your self knowledge and the knowledge of the world have become indistinguishable, become interpenetrating, like what you have when you really love somebody in a committed long-term relationship. Your knowing of yourself and your knowing of them become bound up because you indwell them and you internalize them, and they indwell you and internalize you, right? And
how much death of the old you has this involved for you? I know that's a strange question.
No, it's a good question. It's a damn good question.
Why?
It's a good question because it brings up the idea of the fact that there's a level of knowing that deals with the process of identification itself. In both senses of the word identify, designating something and assuming an identity. In both those senses of identification, the kind of knowing that I most care about is participatory knowing, identification. And therefore, if we're talking about the transformation at that level, we're talking about, that's what I mean about, when I talk about knowing yourself, I don't mean representing yourself, I mean the knowing that constitutes you as a self. And that's what's undergoing the transformation when you're engaged in participatory knowing. When I really love my partner, right, I'm not just forming.
What does it mean that you love them, do you think? If you hadn't expressed that, how do you express that?
Well, I mean, it means a lot. It means I was talking about, but it means that I mean, it's like what Eckhart says. Again, I don't mean to be pretentious. Like he said, you have to make a space.
I don't think you're going to be able to help him in this conversation.
Yeah, that's true. That's fair enough. He says, you have to.
God forgive us.
The goal of Lineland mysticism was to this kind of receptivity. You have to make a space so that the Son of God can be born within you. And again, no, not being irreligious, but for me to love my partner is to cultivate that kind of receptivity, a space in which she can be within me. And I don't mean in any purely romantic, metaphorical sense. What I mean is she finds a purchase within me whereby she can realize herself in both senses of the word realize. And she can come to trust that space, that place of realization will always be available for her. And she can come to rely on it, a place through which she can transcend herself when she needs to. I mean, and being committed to that, and finding that inseparably bound up with my own project of trying to realize who I am. That's for me the core of what it is to love somebody.
That's great. I wish you luck with it.
Well, that's all we can ever wish anybody. I mean, if you
the grace of God.
Or that there is a life to this relationship that will eventually grow strong enough that we can come to trust again as much as we trust in each other. And that's what I believe is happening for me. And I think there's kind of three loves involved, and they're all bound up together. There's, Socratic self-love, not narcissistic self-love. There's the love of the other, and then there's the love of the relationship. That for me is like the Trinity. Talking about it as if they're separate is a mistake. You have to talk about it analytically as if they're separate, but they interpenetrate and inter-afford each other in a profound way. They become in an important sense, indistinguishable from each other.
I've been trying to develop a counterposition to the claim that our society is predicated on the expression of power, and that our social relations are structured as a consequence of the expression of power, and therefore by inference our prime motivation is power, none of which I believe to be true. I think all of that's an aberration in the deepest sense, and I think that what we're talking about is the true path, let's say, to the degree that any of us are capable of realizing that, and I certainly don't claim to be. I struggle with it to an immense degree, but I do believe that it's the proper counterposition. And then so what do you think about that? I mean, is the culture war we're in that deep? I mean, is the counterclaim genuinely the adversarial position? I mean, what else would it be if it's not saying it? It's basically saying that the claim is something like the driving force of Western culture, but I don't know how you distinguish that from the driving force of human culture exactly. I don't think most of the people who make that claim would say there's something it's hard for them to say that there's something radically different about Western culture and the world spirit, let's say, without only attributing all that is negative to Western culture, and that's, I think, very difficult to do. So if the mainstream of Western culture is the mainstream of human culture, or akin to it, so akin to that shamanic tradition, for example, then the claim is that that mainstream is the desire for power, and that's the opposite of what we're saying, genuinely the opposite. It's the antithesis to that, because that isn't Philo Nicaea the antithesis to?
Yeah, I think it is.
Is it genuinely the antithesis? I mean, so is this a claim of satanic possession of the West? I mean, is the culture war that deep? Well, I don't know. I mean, the claim is that it's about fundamentals. Right? It's a fundamental critique of Western society. It means fundamental. That's why Derrida went after philogocentrism.
Yeah, and I think there's, in Foucault does similar things. But the thing you have to remember is, for the ends of Derrida, right, he's reaching into Platonic mysticism, negative theology is something he starts taking interest in Foucault. Technologies of the self, and he gets very deeply interested in the work of Pierre Hadot, right, and what is ancient philosophy and the wisdom tradition and Philosophy Sophia. He starts to turn towards it. He starts to recognize it.
I knew nothing of that.
Yeah, well, that's what. So, I mean,
well, that's very interesting.
Yeah, Foucault also. I'm speaking about. I said he's also getting very.
You won't eat my cupcake.
And then you see Foucault getting very interested in Stoicism and Pierre Hadot's work on the whole Socratic.
And so, what do you think? Okay, so is it reasonable for me to assume that Derrida and Foucault's thinking is at the bottom of the claim that I'm discussing, which culminates in the assumption of power, is at the core
They're
of
cupcakes.
Western endeavor to exercise arbitrary power?
Those are baby cakes.
Is that
They're
the center
bigger
of the
cupcakes.
culture of that claim?
No, muffins are so much better.
Food boys. Sure.
I'm looking for a perhaps for agreement, but that's
Yeah. Not because you eat heaping meals that are for like 3 people.
Direction, or am I saying it clearly?
Had one plate.
What?
I give you the same amount.
I want to say that a relationship
Yeah, for sure.
as a criterion of realness should be
So I try to just now eat
rather than being a
sandwich.
I can't even see.
I think what's coming out, I would argue, out of 40 cognitive science is the growing claim that we don't have a single way of knowing the world. We have a propositional way that, as it says, it is carried in proposition and results in beliefs. We have, which is not knowing that, but we have also procedural knowing. We know how to do things, and it doesn't result in beliefs, it results in skills. We have perspectival knowing, which is neither about belief or skills, it's about states of consciousness and how they create situational awareness for us. And then we have this participatory knowing that we've been talking about throughout, where I know not at the level of my beliefs or my skills or even my states of consciousness, but I know in terms of my traits of my character and how I've been shaped in order to fit the world in a way that seems to fundamentally matter to me. And I think each one of these has a different sense of realness attached to it. I think propositional has truth. I think procedural, our skills give us a sense of realness when they empower us. Our perspectival knowing, what's the sense of realness there? Well, we're getting a good sense of this from virtual reality work. It's a sense of presence, a sense of presence. And then what's the sense of realness for participatory knowing? And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about people try to capture with these words of faith and connection and belonging and fittedness and at one. And I think instead of, right, I think what's happening is our culture is realizing that we have been we have tried to reduce all the knowing out of Bacon to purely propositional knowing, and then we're slowly realizing the inadequacy of that. I think the fact that we are trapped in ideological battle means we think we can capture all the meaning-making machinery at the propositional level. But what Freud cognitive science is saying is, no. I mean, when you talk about tracking, the skill of tracking affords our conceptual abilities, but also states of consciousness afford us being in relationship to the world. You can have totally ineffable states that nevertheless seem the most real to you. And also these transformations of ourselves also carry
I'm done, and I put that just so I did.
The West is realizing that in a negative way that the propositional reduction is inadequate, insufficient, and it's hoping for the closest thing at hand. And the closest thing at hand is what technology makes salient, which is power and control. This is Heidegger's critique. But I think we have to go deeper. We have to say, no, there's a place for that. But your skills ultimately depend on your situational awareness. And your situational awareness, the states of consciousness you get access to,
Welcome to Awful House.
you have to bring back the
Watch the death stare I get when I tell them to get out of the tub.
That's a lot to swallow in 10 statements. I'm going to scuttle back to my power claim momentarily and then try to wrap my head around what you said.
Sorry, I didn't mean to dump so much.
No, not at all. It might have been the answer, the proper answer. The proper answer is often that the question isn't sophisticated enough. You know, sort of throws the questioner because he's operating from within the space where that's the main issue, right? So,
I want waffle fry.
my claim was that the cultural war right now is being fought over the claim that the fundamental animating tendency of Western civilization is the exercise and the exercising of arbitrary power. And I believe that to be fundamentally wrong. And so I phrased it as
I get that reaction all the time.
Is a satanic
Bro, it's like,
hypothesis.
and people are just like,
The accusation is that the West is possessed by this satanic demand for power, and that's its characteristic spirit. And I don't believe that. I believe its characteristic spirit is Phalia, Sophia. Fundamentally, and that is a contamination which occurs repeatedly, which would be Phalia. Nikia. I think if we're using the language properly, or perhaps we're slandering Philia, Nikia, because I think part of the claim that you're making is that there's a positive aspect to Philia, Nikia, that's being damned as the mere arbitrary, something like series like Suits are getting at, right? Because you have these characters in that drama who are motivated primarily by Philia, so Philia and Nikia. But you see Philia and Sophia merge between them, and that's what makes them tolerable as characters. But both those things seem to be interrelated. One leads to the other. And that seems to be related to your wrestling argument in some sense, and maybe to mine, right? At least in part that. First of all, I want to know what is your claim. Let me get this right, at least in part that. First of all, I want to know what you think of my claim about this central argument. What you're doing is saying that's a sideshow and a much deeper. That's a sideshow of a much deeper problem. And that's quite the bloody claim, John. It's not easy for me to process, but and, yeah, well, so I'm having some trouble with that. But do you think that invalidates my claim, or does it just render it irrelevant?
No, it doesn't render it.
Given this discussion, okay, so is it okay if we deal with that and then move on?
Sure. I mean,
the idea of the class struggle into the domain of the sheer power, struggle for power.
I think you could make a claim that the deep interpenetration between power and knowledge. For Derrida, I do not think the difference real relevance realization, the idea that
because that's honesty driven by love.
Right, but I don't.
And so if I trust you, that's what I trust. So my sense of that, I'm going to go back to something. Yeah. I think that's the deepest pleasure. That's the deepest and most lasting pleasure, and it is the most fundamental motivation. It's the inexhaustible source, because if I can do that, whenever I do that, I feel that I'm being properly.
I can extend that to to the world, to situations, places.
Well, I think that's what you're supposed to do by accepting the proposition that God is love. I mean, it's God is love and God is logos. Those are justifiable as brought about by the action of truth in the service of love.
Yeah, I think you're using it, and I've heard you the correspondence between the semantic content of the proposition reality. I've heard you talk about right, and reading. Power is a way, when your shot is true, your skill has been effective, and
You know if it's over 10 minutes long, you can add a second ad in the middle of the video, make this money.
So if you're going to do this, then let's be truthful about it, because the Holocaust isn't about race. See what follows. Now that may seem clickbaity and terrifying, but what we're actually looking at in my latest video on our channel is the way that the pandemic has masked secondary narratives around mental health and the way that you feel, goddammit, while if you income.
Florida for 4 days. The blockade is happening in solidarity with the anti-pandemic measures demonstration that's happening here in Ottawa. So CBC's Aaron Collins behind you. What's the latest? What's happening with those?
Yeah, well, let me tell you about these trucks right behind us, David. These trucks weren't here about 3 hours ago. So I'll just take you back sort of from the start of our day and walk you a little bit through it. Today started with just
we've been burning.
Okay, to Quebec now, where the government will.
Just
Is this
and I get on site, and there's no inspector on the way. So I thought, okay, here we go.
Nurse Ashley Jenkins had no idea that a split-second decision she made that day inside this retirement home would save lives, but kill her career.
A lot of times when people are whistleblowers, they have got long and hard of the decision to become one. They've weighed the pros and the cons. I pretty much became one in the span of about 15 seconds.
Rewind to May 2020, the height of the first wave of the pandemic. This private retirement home, the Roslyn, a 64-bed residence, was the site of Hamilton's COVID outbreak, with a death toll that accounted for in the city. News footage captures what was, at the time, the unthinkable. The entire home had to be evacuated after almost every single...
I was under the impression that I was being brought in to manage a retirement home. I wasn't aware of the extent or the extreme level of crisis that they were in.
So you walk in on your first day expecting to see residents us back to where her world unraveled, the Roslyn in Hamilton, Ontario. I guess it's strange for you to come back into this, right? To look at this.
It's where I'm alive and breathing, and I didn't catch COVID while working here.
16 residents of this home died from COVID. The survivors never returned to the facility, described in the local newspaper as a house of horrors. It was shut down after Ashley blew the whistle. It remains closed to this day. Not only was the Roslyn closed down, but health inspectors revoked the licenses of 6 other homes owned by the same company. The family that owned the chain has now sold off its properties. You were hailed a hero for whistleblowing. People, what do you think would have happened had you not whistleblown?
Absolutely. 100%. It would have been lost in my life.
The temp agency that had hired Ashley fired her almost immediately. In a statement to local media at the time, they cited trust issues. Ontario Premier Doug Ford praised her and said the law would protect her.
There's a law, whistleblower protection. All she was doing was doing her job. If she saw a problem, good for her. I congratulate her. We'll find her a place in a heartbeat.
He didn't find her a place in a heartbeat.
I'm pretty much blackballed from the retirement home industry. If I showed you the sheer number of jobs I've applied to since June 2nd, 2020, you'd be astounded.
That ballpark?
Close to, if not 1,500.
You've applied to well over 1,500 jobs in your field, and no one will hire you.
Because they either see me as a rat, or, they think that I want to come in and make waves.
Whistleblowing has left Ashley unemployed and broke, but not broken.
I know that I wouldn't be able to sleep at the end of the night if I had in any way,
but not broken.
If I had in any way thought I contributed.
Coming up,
I find it disgusting
when no good deed goes unpunished.
I feel there's still a target on my back.
When W5 continues.
I can't let diabetes get in my way. I've got way too much stuff to do. So here's what.
Security for the site.
Chalk River is a village 150 kilometers northwest of Ottawa. It's their laboratory. Chalk River is a village 150 kilometers northwest of Ottawa. It's home to Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, a site focused on research and development of nuclear technologies. This site is so secure, it has a double fence perimeter and some of the most dangerous materials on Earth. That's a big job. Why are you pausing so much time?
About every word that I say, I don't want to in any way compromise my job already more than I already have.
The video that launched all of this.
Hello, it's the boy from that sex with. Taking that sex with a 13-year-old boy.
Ian isn't the person getting caught on camera. That's not even his voice you're hearing.
Are you going to deny it now? Because we got all these recorded phone calls and all the chats. Are you admitting everything?
The voice belongs to one of Ian's colleagues at the Chalk River facility. His name is Dave McAvoy, and he had a controversial hobby. Dave would pose as colleagues at the Chalk River facility. His name is Dave McAvoy, and he had a controversial hobby. Dave would pose on camera. Instead, the focus was on Ian and his co-worker, who had captured two other employees at the nuclear facility in his so-called pre-catcher stings.
The investigation was about 6 terminated, and I was suspended for a month without pay.
For potential blackmail.
It seemed to me like the priority was on the sting.
I wanted to speak to Dave, but as part of that settlement, he had to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Dave has essentially been silenced. To the man who's in this video
for campus.
How does that sit with you, Ian?
I find it disgusting that he was never investigated. He's never even been by the company. The whole focus is on us for reporting it.
W5 requested information. Key recommendations have not been implemented. Devine lays the blame squarely at the feet of the Prime Minister.
Yes, he's been the primary obstacle blocking in our program. But he was elected, having facing scandals as a result.
In today's regulatory environment, companies must wade through numerous complex steps in the normal day-to-day operation.
The breach could be prevented if whistleblowers had protection.
Ian Fiddler is still working as an elite security guard at the nuclear facility. Man.
I feel there's still a target on my back. I feel like people will hold that future or a security threat in the future because
Amidst fears of Quebec separating from Canada, a bold idea emerges. Unity through diversity. Demands for new rights. Ancestral lands are threatened, and Indigenous voices asserted as the Canadian experiment enters a new century. We are explorers, risk takers, and dreamers. Fighting the odds, of extremes. Across a vast continent, we built a nation. Truly strong and free. In 19 of Canada
Can become a model of the just society in which peoples of many cultures will live in harmony.
Canada becomes the first world leader to make multiculturalism official policy. It puts Canada on the world stage. By 1971, 80% of our immigrants are from Europe. That's about to change. 1970, 300 are crammed into a dictatorship. These overcrowded boats are the only way.